A small girl was promised by her brother that she could accompany him to the top of a hill. It was a place where he liked to go to play. And so they took off together. But when they got to the bottom of the hill, the little girl said, "But there aren't any smooth places to walk on. It's all stony and bumpy." And her brother, who was much more experienced, said, "And what did you think we would use to climb to the top? We step on the stones and bumps to get up there." This is the second sermon in the series of our journey in spiritual awareness. As Team Spirit thought about this, we decided to work on a progression of themes. Last week we talked about blessing and gratitude and an invitation to see that God is with us. Today, our theme is upheaval and change. This may seem like a puzzling and unnecessary part of spiritual growth. Actually, as the older brother said, the stones and the bumps are what we need to walk on. Upheaval comes as a back door to understanding not only that God is with us, but that God is for us. In times of testing, our hope in God can be restored. And as Jim Wallace says, hope is believing in spite of the evidence and watching the evidence change. An elderly woman was greatly perturbed by many troubles, both real and imaginary. Finally, her family tactfully told her, "Grandma, we've done all we can do for you. You'll have to trust on God from here on out." A look of absolute despair crossed her face, and she said, "Oh dear, has it come to that?" The author noted, it always comes to that, so we might as well start there. Often life's crises and anxieties happen in terms of loss or disorder. Loss of a job, a disturbing medical diagnosis, the death of a family member or friend, the pain of a broken relationship, natural and man-made disasters that rob us of our security, and even the sense that God has abandoned us. Those who turn to the Bible to seek comfort will likely go to the Psalms, which can help us pray our emotions. When we're tempted to follow the urgent, seductive pursuits of the world, Psalm 1 offers us the way of calm and focused attention. While pursued by enemies and armies, David said, "The Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear?" In the midst of our grumbling, Psalm 100 says, "Make a joyful noise." And while Psalm 137 expresses anger and vengeance, Psalm 150 invites us to see life as mystery and gift. Actually, about 1/3 of the Psalms are lament, suffering people begging God to come and rescue them. Eventually, God begins to work in circumstances and inside our heart, and these complaints turn to peace. Almost every lament in the Psalms begins in trouble but ends in hope. Almost, that is, except Psalm 88. It's a dark psalm. God gives us the gift of prayer that does not resolve. Faith means staying even though answers don't come. And Psalm 88 is an important psalm to have in our repertoire because life is like that. We all go through periods of darkness. The 16th century contemplative, John of the Cross, writes about the dark night of the soul. It is a heavy sense that the God who loved us and listened to us is no longer there, is silent. When I took a class in the Psalms, one of our assignments was to paraphrase and illustrate a lament psalm. And I chose Psalm 77, a poem that expresses God's abandonment, but starts out in crying and ends up in hope. My paraphrase and illustrations are very, very simple, but I'd like to share it with you. A look at Psalm 77. God, where are you? I'm lost without you. I reach out my hand for you, but you are not there. I think of you and cry out. I cannot sleep. I cannot speak. I search my spirit to know what I have done to offend you. Every road I take to find you leads me to a dead end. Where are you? Why can't I find you? Have I lost your favor? Don't you love me anymore? Are the promises of God no longer valid? Have you forgotten how to be gracious to me? What have I done that you are so angry with me? I grieve, Lord. I used to call on you and you answered me, but you've changed. Now I can't count on you to be there when I need you. But yet, I remember the wonders you did for my parents and grandparents and great-grandparents. They trusted you and you were faithful to them. I need to think about this some more. God, now I see, you are holy. What other God is as great as you? You work wonders. You display your might in many ways. I see that now, God. With your strong arm, you have saved your people. I remember the stories of Jacob and Joseph. But your strength is also something to be feared. Even the waters fear you, for you can part them. The skies open and pour down rain. Thunder clashes and arrows of lightning show your fierce power. You shake up the world. Yet in the midst of your power show, you make a path for us to escape. Your path goes right through the sea, right through the mighty waters. I can't see your footprints, but I know you are there. You led your people like a shepherd. Your path finally led out into green pastures. Your servants, Moses and Aaron, followed you through the storm because they trusted you. Let me remember. Help me to trust you too. Compared to other nations, North American Christians can be naive about suffering. We live in a world where everything is designed to fix our distress. We go to the doctor to replace our bad knee. We go to the pharmacist for quick pain relief. We leave neighborhoods, jobs, spouses, or children to avoid suffering. I suspect that most people bypass the lament psalms because they trouble our spirits. But by ignoring them, we give two messages. Either you shouldn't feel angry at God, or if you do, you'd better keep a lid on it because people will think your faith is nothing. Walter Brueggemann, an Old Testament scholar, says, in deference to a God who is perfect, we have assumed that if something's wrong, it must be our fault. Of course, sometimes it is our fault, and we need to confess that. When we cannot acknowledge our need or fear or anger, it gets transposed into guilt. We feel obligated to turn these poems of anger and rage into prayers of polite petition. Christian spirituality is often marked by humility and submission. However, Jewish spirituality includes a vigorous protest. Brueggemann continues, Hebrew intuition is incapable of monologue. It uses conversation and dialogue and relational communication in which God is fully vested. In these lament psalms, Israel holds up its part of the conversation, which is necessary if God is to be known by the Israelites. There's something very Jewish in the lament psalms that the church has to recover. Israel cries out, threatens, orders, groans, and exalts, not only as an act of sin, but as an act of fidelity. For people who feel the conventional world is falling apart, The lament psalms are the right speech. And personally, I am convinced that God would rather we shout our frustrations and anger at him than hear nothing at all. About 6 weeks after Carrie and I started dating, I sat with Carrie while he fixed his VW Bug, putting on a new muffler. Our conversation revolved around our faith journeys, and I took the risk of telling him, I hate God. I didn't see him for more than a week. He didn't understand that the God I hated was the judging God I heard about in pulpits, and that I was challenging the divine to show me a loving God. Since my Christian faith professor knew where I was coming from, I took Carrie to meet him. And in a simple statement, Dr. Krause said, I'm so sorry to be part of a church that did this to you. And in that moment, my anger melted away, and I understood the love of God. I understood for the first time that the theology I absorbed as a child was not biblical theology at all. It is often in retrospect that we recognize the blessing accompanying pain, that God is with us, God is for us, and the footprints of God are right there along the way, carrying us back to hope. One author says, in adversity, we usually want God to do a removing job when he wants to do an improving job. Let me share some storm stories with you. These are people that you will recognize. In 1818, 9-year-old Lewis was helping his father in a harness shop. His father drew a design on a piece of leather and said, take a hole puncher and a hammer and follow this design, but be careful you don't hit your fingers. Excited, Lewis began the work, but when he hit the hole puncher, it flew out of his hand and pierced his eye, and he became blind. A few years later, Lewis was sitting in the family garden when a friend handed him a pine cone, and with his sensitive fingers, he felt the pine cone, and then an idea came to him. Using touch, he created an alphabet of raised dots on paper so people with visual impairments could read. His name, of course, was Louis Braille. When we listen to the exalting music of Handel's Messiah, we might assume that he was at the peak of his success. But in fact, it was written after he had a stroke and consequently lived in poverty. He suffered through a particularly dark night of gloom and despair over his failure as a musician. But the next morning, he unleashed the creative genius in a musical score that we remember and treasure over and over. Third story. Louis Banks was a fine Christian singer who learned he had cancer of the tongue. Preparing for his surgery, he asked the doctor, "Are you sure I will never sing again?" The surgeon simply shook his head no. Louis said, "Then let me sit up and sing one more song of praise to God." And there in the doctor's presence, the man softly sang the hymn written by Isaac Watts. "I'll praise my Maker while I breath, and when my voice is lost in death, praise shall employ my nobler power. My days of praise shall ne'er be past, while life and thought and being last, for immortality endures." Most of us have our own stories of overcoming despair, and some of our stories may still be in progress. Discovering God's grace in adversity comes slowly, and we can't always switch on gratitude automatically. I'd like to share some observations about this process from despair to gratitude. Sometimes we try to push through to a desired result and then fail to learn the lessons that would make us stronger. I love the way the Jesuit priest Desjardins states in his poem, Patient Trust. Above all, trust in the slow work of God. We are quite naturally impatient in everything to reach the end without delay. We should like to skip the intermediate stages. We're impatient to be on the way to something unknown, something new. And yet it is the law of all progress that it is made by passing through some stages of instability, and it may take a very, very long time. And so I think it is with you. Your ideas mature gradually. Let them grow. Let them shape themselves without undue haste. Do not try to force them on as though you could be today what time will make of you tomorrow. Only God could say what this new spirit gradually forming within you will be. Give our Lord the benefit of believing that his hand is leading you, and accept the anxiety of feeling yourself in suspense and incomplete. Second, sometimes we put our trust in the wrong thing. Leonard Sweet says in a sermon, I have no problem driving a car across a bridge going 50, 60, 70 miles an hour. I'm never tempted to get close to the edge, but if a car edges me over, I sail along as if there were no guardrails. But take away the guardrails. Now that's a different story. Without any protection to keep my car from driving right over the edge, I crawl across that bridge at 10 or 20 miles an hour. We all need guardrails. If they are there, we don't need them. But if they are not there, we can become frozen in fear, or we risk going off the deep end. In Philippians 3, Paul warns the church not to worship the guardrails and safety guards, but rather to worship the bridge who carries us across, Jesus Christ. He says, everything I once thought I had going for me is insignificant. But I am well on my way, reaching out to Christ, who has so wondrously reached out to me. By no means do I count myself an expert, but I've got my eye on the goal. Let's keep focused on that goal, those of us who want everything that God has for us. Story number 3, or observation number 3. Often turmoil moves us to something better. There was a janitor at St. Peter's Church in London. One day a young vicar discovered that he was illiterate and fired him. Jobless, the man invested his meager savings into a small village shop. The business prospered and became a chain of stores worth thousands of dollars. The man's banker said, "You've done well for an illiterate. I wonder where you'd be if you could read or write." Well, the man said, "I'd be janitor at St. Peter's Church in Neville Square." Observation 4. Sometimes we forget to use all the resources we have available. The story's told of a little boy and his father. They were walking along a road when they came to a big stone. The boy looked at it, and then he asked his father, "Do you think if I use all my strength that I could move that stone?" The father thought for a moment and said, "I think that if you use all your strength, you can do it." That's all the little boy needed. He ran over to the rock and began to push on it. He pushed and pushed until the sweat was coming down his forehead, but the rock didn't move. Not an inch, not even a half an inch. After a while, the little boy sat down. His face was crestfallen, and his whole body just sagged like a lump on the ground. "You were wrong," he told his dad. "I can't do it." His father walked over to him, and kneeling beside him, he put his arm around him and said, "You can do it. You just didn't use all your strength. You didn't ask me for help." When we experience upheavals in our lives, we may need to pass through some stages of instability. We need to be careful whom we put our trust in. We need to be open to new and better possibilities. And we need to use all the resources at our disposal. God does not cause the turmoils of our life. But God does stick with us through the process of grief and instability, surprising us with new life. As Paul reminds us in Romans 8:28, we know that in all things God works for good to those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose. And all the people said, Amen.